Zack Polanski's pitch for leader of the Greens is that he can have a bigger impact on the media by proactively defending left-wing policies. He had a big test this weekend with an appearance on Laura Kuenssberg's BBC show.
Zack, do you have any sympathy for the position that the government is in? I mean, they did take over at a time when the economy had been battered because of Ukraine and because of COVID. Public services have had a hard time for a long time. When you look at what they're doing and the sort of straitjacket they're in, do you have any sympathy for them?
No, I don't think it's easy, but I think it's very simple. We actually need to tax wealth and not work. And you asked Angela Rayner several times at that beginning of the interview, will you tax wealthy people more? And she gave you some very small measures that are tinkering at the edges. Actually, if we put a wealth tax on assets of 1%, we could be raising billions of pounds.
Then leave? So you earn less money because all the wealthy leave.
Well, so it's actually a myth. There's a group called the Patriotic Millionaires, who are a group of wealthy individuals who are saying taxes more, because actually no matter how rich you are, we all benefit from a more equal society.
There's quite a lot of evidence, though, that many very wealthy people have left the country. If you talk to anyone in the city, that's what they would tell you. And people who put forward suggestions of wealth taxes, when those things have been brought in before, they often don't deliver anything like what you might hope.
Well, I'd refute that evidence, but I'd say more fundamentally, if people don't want to spend money in tax to our public services, then are they really contributing to our country? I'd say more widely on your question too, Angela Rayner talked about a humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza. I describe it as a genocide. And when we have a government that are ultimately complicit, in fact, actively participating by arming them, I think when the public watch interviews like that, it just feels completely disconnected from material reality. And that's both on domestic affairs, but also international affairs too. And I think both interviews are an example of why people are rejecting the two old parties, because they're seeing politicians say things that just materially aren't reality.
That clip's been viewed a couple of 100,000 times on X, which will presumably be helpful to Zack's leadership campaign. Kieran, how do you think he did?
Well, I think, first of all, Michael, you did much better job of interviewing him than Laura Kuenssberg did, because you didn't ask absurd questions. Yeah, I mean, look, I don't know what to make of Zack Polanski. I think we're all in the same boat on the left. We're tentatively hopeful. I'm tentatively hopeful. Of course, there was a lot of stuff dredged up about what he'd said about Corbyn and anti-Semitism and so on. But I think he gave a pretty cogent answer to that when you asked him about it, Michael. In that particular clip, it's really good that we're normalizing politicians saying the G word, saying genocide on shows like the Laura Kuenssberg show. That's a good thing. And, we need to try and kind of normalize that as much as possible, because, of course, we know that that's what's actually going on. But there was one thing, I just seeing that more or less for the first time. There is one major thing that he could have said that he didn't say, specifically about the taxation thing. I wish he'd said about assets not being able to shift assets out of the country, essentially. So he talks about Patriotic Millionaires, the group, fine. He talks about how there's actually, some data and evidence to suggest that people don't, there isn't an exodus. But he didn't talk about the fact that when you tax assets, which are static assets that exist in the UK, land, buildings, etc., you can't move those out physically. And I think that was probably his ace of spades there, but he didn't really use it. So that's fine. It's not the end of the world. But yeah, overall, I think he did well. And I think his kind of left populism and inverted Farageism or something, a bit of charisma, a bit of personality and a bit of flair wouldn't go amiss on the left and left populism and so on. So let's see. I think, but I think, in the area that I alluded to, room for improvement.
Yeah, I thought he did well. I hope he wins. I think he makes the sort of political scene much more interesting than if the other two do. We've still no one can remember his name. Adrian Ramsey, I do know his name now, but it did take me a while. And if you look at the YouGov polls, no one really knows who he is. Obviously, no one knows who Zack Polanski is either, but he hasn't been party for 2 or 3 years. So I think if you've been a party leader for that long and still no one knows who you are, it's probably time for a change. So on we've been talking about this in the studio, that we need to get more people on who can sort of talk us through the step-by-step of how a wealth tax works, because the the response that people always give, sort of, as you saw Laura Kuenssberg do there, is to say, wealth tax, great idea, doesn't work. And I need to sort of find some people who can sort of articulately explain exactly how it works. Because I know Gary Stevenson says, well, you can't move the asset, so you just tax the asset. Now, I suppose the response to that would be that it's very politically difficult to tax, people's first homes. So if you're only trying to tax the super rich do have some of their assets sort of physically in the street, their big houses. But it's once you get to the super rich that you are talking about shares and sort of paper money.
Yeah.
Someone's worth 100 million or 100 billion because they own XYZ company, which is worth XYZ on the stock market. And I suppose they are the people who can potentially move. I don't really have the answers here. I suppose I'm putting that to you. Is it as simple enough as saying, well, you can't move the house abroad, so a wealth tax is easy? How do you see it working in practice?
I mean, look, just on the stocks and shares and that kind of thing, the most effective way, I think, to tax that would be a what's called a financial transaction tax. So it gained popularity after the financial crisis. It was synonymized as a Tobin tax, named after a guy called Tobin who proposed it, an economist. That would be basically a tax that taxes every single transaction that goes through the ether, if you like, in the financial system, which would have two effects. It would gain it would obviously draw money to the exchequer or to the treasury, but it would also caution against speculative, very reckless speculative gambling in the financial system, right? Because obviously if you're having to pay every time you make a transaction, you're less likely to just say, fuck it, I'll do whatever. So basically a wealth tax is a composite term for a multitude of things. And you're right, Michael, it's kind of, it's quite an obtuse term because it's a composite term. So I think just to make it kind of simple, because we've only got 3 minutes left, you could look at very basic things like taking us from a kind of council tax system, if you like, to a land value tax system in this country. And that would, the clue is in the name, it would tax land on the basis of its value. That's something that even people like Tony Blair have thrown their weight behind. 10, 15 years ago, Blair said he was in favour of it after he left office. So it's something that does kind of unite quite a broad section of political and intellectual opinion. So a wealth tax could be a land value tax. A wealth tax could be a windfall tax. I mean, it could be a windfall tax on a business, right? It could be a windfall tax on a sector that's done particularly well. It could be raising capital gains so that it goes from around 10%, which is absurdly low, to bring it in line with income tax, right? So the income tax bracket. What Zack Polanski was saying about tackling wealth, not work. When we talk about work, the traditional tax obviously is the income tax, and what a wealth tax could do. One thing a wealth tax could do, quite a modest thing really, is bring capital gains, so the money that you accrue on, things like properties and land and so on, after the time of purchase, you could bring it in line with income tax, and that would net, I think some studies suggest, around 10 billion a year additional money for the Treasury. So there are many things that you could do, and you're right to kind of break it into, static assets that are in the UK, which is kind of what I was referring to as could have been a good counter argument to what Laura Kuenssberg was saying. And then, of course, the kind of more, amorphous digital kind of financial transactions, which you would need international cooperation on. You'd need an international agreement around financial transaction taxes.
Yeah, I'm very into land value taxes. I quite like the Georgists, but I think politicians always say it's very difficult because then, it was got sort of floated, I think, in sort of when Corbyn was leader, sort of just put in a paper by Laurie McFarlane and some other people who've been on the show. And then even the fact that this research paper had been done, The Sun and the Daily Mail were like, Labour want to tax your garden. So it's always very politically difficult. So it's always hard to sort of, how are you going to do the tax where the rich can't leave, but you don't hit enough middle class people that the newspapers or that the right sort of have a good attack line against you? Very interesting question. We're going to have to sort of really break this down in future shows, I think. Exactly how would a wealth tax work beyond the slogans? We'll bring that to you soon, don't worry. But for now, we are out of time. Kieran, thank you so much for joining me this evening. Always a pleasure having you on.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
And thank you everyone for tuning in. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.